Welcome to the Caffeine stream on caffeine and philosophy.
All right, I am here with Dr. Mathias Nordvig. Matthias, thanks so much for coming on. Can you, you're essentially a PhD in Viking studies, but I'm sure we can be more specific than that. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me on, Chris. It's great to be here. Yeah, so I have a PhD in well, I wrote my PhD about Nordic mythology and specifically how the Icelandic environment might have changed some aspects to the stories as they were transported across the North Atlantic from the Scandinavian mainland. Um, so I dove into stuff about volcanoes and other important aspects of Icelandic geology. Um, and so I became known as the volcano guy, I guess.
Rumor has it Iceland has a volcano or two. I don't
They
know if those are
do.
true or not, but that's what I've heard.
Yes, yeah. I think if I remember correctly, 35 of them. So, and they're pretty active as well. So yeah, so that's what I did my PhD in, and I have a general background in Viking studies, both from a philological perspective and also from a historical and also from the perspective of the history of religion as well. So sort of like a jack of all trades when it comes to the Viking Age. And that was very much my purpose when I started studying all of this. I wanted to know as many aspects of it as possible. So yeah, I dabble in many different aspects of that
Yeah.
period.
It's super cool. Academia has, I think, acquired a reputation recently of people who just spend time on like Twitter and in the library and acquiring and reading books. Whereas when you go back into the old days, you have, these guys who would, in order to investigate some ancient thing, they'd actually go somewhere and they'd speak to locals with their recording machine, hauling hundreds of pounds of equipment or whatnot. And what's interesting about you is that you are an academic, but you're also not just an academic. You're also something of a practitioner of
Yeah.
these Nordic religions and stuff. And it's always fascinating and cool to see that intersection because I mean, in my own, foot in the puddle experience, you can get a lot of sort of silliness in religious practice without that academic background, but you can also get a kind of not vapidity, but a kind of emptiness in
Hmm.
the academia without the practice. So when you have those two working together, it creates something that's always feels a lot more interesting.
Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you for saying that. That's a really I that's I feel honored to hear that from um so yeah, I mean, I was raised with the Nordic. I loathe to say the word pagan because I really don't really like that term, but that tradition from my parents, and when it comes to uh, incorporating sort of a general practice in context of my academic studies. I can also say that first time I sailed on a Viking ship, I was 3 years old. So I sort of got that with me as well, and that's part of growing up in Denmark. If you have adventurous parents who think history is a cool thing, I spent a lot of time in my early years in various kinds of reenactment style arenas, and that's a little different over in Scandinavia where I'm from, um, because it's a lot of it is tied to museums as well, so it's part of the museum activities. And they started back in the 70s. trying to build Viking ships in the way that they know that people did in the Viking Age, and then trying to sail them as well. And I sort of like back in the 80s, I got to be part of that.
That is super cool. And it brings to mind two questions. I want to see if I can ask them at the same time. Um, it sounds from your upbringing and from your background, then it puts you in a very interesting position to ask the question that I had really wanted to bring you on to ask you about, which is this question of Reconstructionism, and to what degree are these pagan religions, again, pagan with scare quotes, broad umbrella term, etc. To what degree are those trying to sort of bring back dead religions, and people are worshiping dead gods, which is a criticism you often hear, especially in the American context, of Americans who are getting into Asatru. And the related question is where the line is, in your opinion, between what is in a denigrating fashion referred to as LARPing versus what is reenacting, which every religion that I'm aware of does in a very sacred manner, in a way that is even respected by other religions, especially in the Greek world. I'm slightly more familiar with, like, almost all great holidays and festivals and funeral events are reenactments of some heroic trial, and the line between LARPing and reenacting seems to be a very, very thin one.
Yes. So let me start with that one, because let's go to the Philippines, where you have during the Easter ceremonies, right? The Philippines are largely Catholic, right? You have people who will get crucified, like they
Yes,
envision Christ God.
I've seen that. It's
Yeah,
brutal. Yeah.
that is brutal, and I'm like, wow, okay, yeah. um and you have to you have to ask yourself, is that LARPing reenactment, right? It's a very hardcore form of it, right?
The highest tier of LARPing, yes.
The highest tier, yeah. I mean, what they're doing is that they are connecting with their tradition in their specific way. And I haven't delved deeply into it, but I assume that those people who undergo those trials, they get something really intense from it. They get a really intense religious experience. And I would say that so if you extrapolate upon that, and you look at other traditions that in other ways reenact stories that are tied to their religious universe, um, or dress up in clothing that they perceive as essentially clothing that will bring them closer to what they consider sacred, right? So when it comes to these northern traditions that largely connect with the Viking era, and you see people go to rituals dressed up in either in period correct clothes, or clothes that they assume would be something that was worn by somebody in the Viking Age. That is part of bringing them closer as well. And in that sense, I'd say there's very little difference. You can then you start poking into the aesthetics of it all, and I have a lot of personal opinions about that. That's my my opinion. There's a lot of stuff that I look at and I'm like, I don't know what this is, but other people will have created their tradition and their ideas about what is meaningful in terms of like dressing up, in terms of what they do at the rituals. And I don't feel that I should criticize that, because that's their religious perspective.
Right.
So that then brings me to the other question about, well, to what degree are we reconstructing something? And this is where it gets really tricky, because we have to actually start with the source material that we have. So we have very, very few sources to anything about the Nordic gods that were actually written by people who we could assume believed in them.
Yes.
So
I
that's
have
where we have to start, right?
I have a friend named Clinton McMillan who's pointed out that many of the some of the more popular sagas are written by Christians, with perhaps some ulterior, perhaps political motives in how the narratives are constructed, particularly in how Odin and Thor are portrayed relative to each other.
Hmm.
But I
Yeah.
have to wait for his full theory on that.
Well, I can give you a little bit of insight into what we know about the literature from Iceland. It's primarily from Iceland. There's a little bit from mainland Scandinavia, but primarily from Iceland. We have this range of texts that we in 19th century and 20th century scholarship have essentially decided to categorize in different genres. And those genres that we have chosen, they mirror more or less the types of literary genres that existed in the 19th and 20th century. Um, so so we have, for instance, the Icelandic sagas. And the Icelandic sagas, they branch out into kings sagas, sagas about the families in Iceland, the early settler families. And then we have legendary sagas. They're the ones where you get most of the Nordic mythology stuff. You asked me about Starkadr before we started, and his story would be one of those legendary sagas. Then we also have a bunch of other sagas. There are, for instance, sagas about Icelandic bishops as well, and they're of course not pagan at all. And then we have,
But they tell us something about the genre.
they tell us something about the lives of people in the medieval period. And so in that sense, and they also show us a lot about what medieval Icelanders knew of continental European literature, because a lot of them are modeled over existing literature from France, Germany, and England primarily. And then we also have contemporary sagas, which are sagas written in the 1200s, and they're about people in the 1200s. So that's how we know a lot about, for instance, Snorri Sturluson, who wrote Edda, which is one of our best sources. Well, it's not best in the sense that it's actually that good, but it's best in the sense that it gives us a lot of information in different ways that we can then sift through. We have so much knowledge about this person who wrote Edda because of a contemporary saga that was written right after he died, pretty much. So that's sort of like the range of like saga literature we have. Then we have poetry. Some of it has survived from the Viking Age, and some of it has been composed a little later on, and some of it has we can see that there are definitely elements of it that were composed in the Viking Age, and then people have been building on it through the medieval period after people converted to Christianity. And so what does all of this mean? Well, it means that we have this like whole range of literature that people decided after they had converted to Christianity in Iceland. They said this literature that mentions the Nordic gods and have stories about Odin, Thor, Loki, Freyr, all of these deities that we assume people venerated before the conversion. And I say assume because we can't actually know that much about it. Going back to this thing, we have very limited source material from before then. They decided that all of this literature is still relevant even though we have become Christian. And then they also decided, well, we have to explain why. Why is this relevant? Well, it's of course culturally relevant. That's why it's still there. but how do we sort of like fit that in a frame of our now Christian mindset? And this is what you can see with Snorri Sturluson's Edda. He starts with God created the world. And then he gives us a story about the flood and Adam and Eve. And then he starts telling us how people went astray, forgot the name of God, and then began worshiping essentially their ancestors. And he also tells us that they counted their lineage back to Earth. And so they believed Earth was alive. And this is a medieval Christian perspective on pre-Christian traditions. So when we read Edda and we read all the stories about Odin and Thor and all of that stuff, we have to keep that in the back of our mind. Snorri Sturluson,
Right.
he was sitting there and he thought that these were people who had existed on planet Earth, just like you and me. And then they died, and then people started venerating them as deities. And also he believed they came from Troy, which was a very common theme at the time. So when we want to reconstruct something, we have to, first of all, keep that source criticism in mind. We have to look at this whole range of literature. And then we have to keep in mind that when somebody tells us something, like some medieval author tells us something about what a Viking did in like a pagan ritual, there's a very high likelihood that this medieval author is doing the exact same thing as I would if I were writing a horror novel or something like that today, making it a little more extreme than it needed to be.
A good Christian would never do that. I don't mean to. I don't mean to poke. The account that actually comes to my mind, and I don't know to what degree this is believed to be exaggerated or accurate, is the Arab. Is it Ibn Fadlan? Am I remembering that correctly? The Arab Muslim man who traveled with Vikings for some time. The inspiration for, was it the 13th Warrior? And or Eaters of the Dead by the Jurassic Park guy. The name escaped me. Yes, the name escaped me for a moment. But his account is interesting because it has a mixture of positive and negative elements.
So, and this is another problem we also have with, sources to the Viking Age. We have those sagas that are homegrown, but they're written after the fact, right? It's several centuries after. Then we have contemporary stories of all kinds. We have Ibn Fadlan. We also have a couple of other Muslim visitors to Scandinavia, and we have Yaqub al-Tatushi from Cordoba, the caliphate in Spain at the time. We have Al-Ghazal as well, who's probably writing based off of reports that he's heard from others. So he hasn't actually gone anywhere. He's just, he's just sitting at the harbor listening to good stories or something like that. Then you have Adam of Bremen, the clerk in the bishopric in Hamburg, Bremen, in northern Germany, who actually visited Denmark, but Denmark was at the time thoroughly Christian. So the reports he's giving us on like stuff, pagan stuff, they're questionable in that sense. However, he did spend time at the Danish king's court, and Svein Austríðarson, who was the king at the time, he had lived in Sweden for about 10 years. And, Adam is reporting on the temple in Uppsala in Sweden. So, there's also the possibility that he's synthesizing multiple stories about different temples, because we know archaeologically there's actually been a lot of temples around in Scandinavia. Archaeologists don't like to call them temples, but they kind of are. So that's just like some examples of like the diversity, right? And what's the case with all of these outside reporters, right, is of course that they are removed from the culture. They have their own biases, and they also have their own sort of like taxonomy in their heads. So I mentioned how the Christian authors of the Icelandic sagas, they they came up with a framework for explaining how there could be people who believed in other gods than God. And you have a similar situation with Ibn Fadlan when he is looking at these possible Scandinavians. And his book is actually quite extensive. He's reporting on a lot of different peoples as he's moving through the Russian area. He talks about different Turkish peoples and Slavic peoples and so on. And what he is actually doing when he's looking at them is he's evaluating them on basis of what is haram in the Islamic tradition. So he's looking at cleanliness. He's looking at how do they behave sexually,
I
how do
remember
they eat and
his
drink,
criticisms of cleanliness in particular.
right? And then on the flip side of that, in England, that's about 100 years later, you have English basically
Oh,
complaining about how the Scandinavians are
taking the
stealing their
wives of
women.
women English
Yeah.
because they're too clean and well groomed.
Yes, they bathe on Saturdays, and ooh, we can't have that. So we have two conflicting stories
Mhm.
here, right? And what Ibn Fadlan is describing is really gross. Like this is these guys, they get up in the morning, they have like one bowl with water in it, and then they all like wash in it and spit in it and all that kind of stuff without changing the water. Like, yeah, we're disgusted just like thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
And you know what? Both could be true because we don't actually know that much about these people he's reporting about. We don't know what kind of people they are. We can see a little bit from his descriptions. Like we know that they're like proper Vikings. They're the ones who are going out, sailing on their ships. They're trading slaves. That's a specific kind of people. They're all men, and they all live in these communal houses together. I mean, we know how this works. A bunch of dudes hanging out, like we start getting weird habits, right? So that could be very true as well, that they would have that kind of hygiene, right? But
Everyone who is in the military is kind of looking sideways and thinking, I don't know what
exactly
you're
right.
talking about. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. The weird things that go on in a camp, right? And that's so. But when we look at what he's describing with the burial ritual and how he describes the dress and jewelry, weaponry, all of this stuff, that fits one to one with the archaeological record. Like
Mm.
we can see, um like from Scandinavia, we have excavated several boat graves, right? Big Viking ships with all kinds of grave goods, sacrificed animals, horses, multiple humans, all this stuff. This is exactly what he's describing. So in that sense, he seems to be on point in terms of describing a Scandinavian culture. So then we have to like look at the other things that he's telling us. And then we have to question, for instance, he's also the only source that tells us that they tattooed. He says that they're tattooed from their neck to their fingernail. And this is something that, scholars have been debating for a very long time. Is that actually true? Well, everything else he's telling us seems to be true. So there's a very high likelihood that that is also true.
Mm.
Um, and but otherwise he does have that bias that he's looking at what he essentially perceives as some uncivilized savages. They don't know God. Their life is basically haram. So right.
Yeah. And from that problem of projection, um, I can almost empathize with the scholars who don't want to call these sites temples for fear of giving people the wrong idea. Because I mean, they can still function as sacred places, but as soon as you call it a temple, it would be worse is to call it a church, because that would immediately put in mind certain activities that we who I'm speaking for myself here, not for you, who were raised in Christian culture would imagine religiosity looking like from a Christian foundation and framework.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was speaking with Dr. Naj, he said, the Greek myths are not so much stories to believe in, but stories to live by. And it's a
Hmm.
completely different mindset. And Christians who ask, do you really believe in Zeus? Do you really believe in, Ares? It's the wrong question.
Hmm.
And that's such a hard mental hurdle for people to get over. It seems when dealing with um, you know uh, pagan religions of all varieties and shapes, and I imagine that's true with the Nordic stuff as well.
Absolutely, and this is actually we're hitting at the core of the problem with reconstructing, because if we have grown up with a Christian, if nothing else, Christian cultural background, we have a
Mm.
very specific idea about what religion is. Like, for instance, one of the things I hear a lot from people who are also true heathen, pagans, and so on, is that like they 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 reject the word religion in and of itself. Me as a scholar, I don't, because
Yeah,
religion means any kind of practice that
yeah. Well,
involves deities and spirits and
it's,
that kind
it's
of stuff.
funny. Christians will do that too. I've gotten into a couple arguments with Christians who said, well, Christianity isn't a religion; it's a relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
Unlike every other religion in the world, right?
Right. Yes. And that's Christian exceptionalism that you get there. This is I've heard that a lot from people with so like the more evangelical mindset. That
Mm.
that's where I've heard had those conversations. And yeah, that's also a way to think about Christianity, because then you take it completely outside of that quote unquote questionable space of religion and say this is reality, right? Um, so yeah, that's another way to go about it. But yeah, people have a set idea about what religion is, or at least when it comes to the sort of like the more pagan crowd, and that is that, oh, this is a church that has a bunch of dogma that I need to follow. Otherwise, I'm not believing right, so to speak. And then these set rituals and a priest. That's pretty much what religion seems to mean to a lot of people in this neo-pagan space. Whereas, from this academic perspective, religion is sort of any practice that involves venerating deities or spirits, or whatever it is. Religion is found in the deep jungle, it is found in a church, it is found in your house, it is found everywhere, right? So, so that's one of the problems that we have with the notion of reconstructing, and um, and so we have this set of source material. Some would call it lore, and I I try to avoid that term, because that sort of like elevates it to sort of like a Bible kind of
Right.
kind of framework, and I don't. What we actually have to understand about the Christian cultural context that we come from, all of us. I do too, even though I was raised by pagan parents. I mean, I have had a lot of interaction with Christianity through my entire life as well. I mean, I come from one of the few actual Christian countries in the world, like Denmark. We that is our official religion. And this is taught in schools, and so it's just part of your life in so many different ways, right? And what we actually have to realize is that Christianity and Islam as such are, um from the perspective of history of religion, quite odd religions. Like they're the anomaly more than the norm. Whereas what you find in pre-Christian Greece, Rome, anywhere in Asia, and Europe for that matter, in Africa, is what like that's what people have been doing for a very long time, until we had that shift to Christianity and Islam, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's an interesting thing too, because in looking back historically, I don't know if I can say this with any authority on like all the world, but it seems that in many parts of the world there was very often not religious homogeneity, but there always seemed to be a like two dueling factions vying. Like in China, you had Confucianism, which is in some ways very, I pronounced that weird, in some ways very pagan, um, and Taoism sort of coexisting together. And Taoism is, it's not quite monotheist, but I have an uncle who is an Orthodox Christian priest.
Hmm.
Actually, he's ordained, and he actually enjoys studying Taoism. He thinks it's actually more or less identical with Orthodox Christianity.
Hmm. Yeah, I can
And
see that.
in Japan, you have Shinto, which is very pagan, very classically pagan, coexisting throughout most of the medieval era with Zen Buddhism,
Hmm.
which is, it's not exactly monotheistic, but it's very monotheistic like in many ways. And my friend I mentioned before has been talking a lot about a Thor cult that was very dominant um, in certain parts of Finland, in particular, among the
Hmm.
Sami people, but presumably among others as well. And that also coexisted with, of course, the more traditional stuff. So perhaps there might have been, Christianity overtaking the the prevailing monotheistic and still competing with the pagan culture at the time.
Yeah, so the thing about uh, when we talk about all this, we should keep in mind that there's definitely a split between what the elite is doing
Mm,
and what people are doing, because people will do what they need to do when it comes to religion, and you can see that with the Christianity today, especially here in America. There are so many New Age concepts that are circulating in sort of like mainstream American Christianity. I see this all the time. I follow different Christian creators on Instagram, for instance, and I see, I know exactly where that came from. That's like 19th century from this and that book and so on, right?
one of my favorite scholars is James Lindsay has been pointing out the dangers of Christian nationalism on one hand, but on the other hand, he's been pointing to the dangers of what's called liberation theology, which is more of a Latin American Catholic thing, but it has crept its way northward, and it is very much not Christian in its
Yeah.
origin, but it's often accepted by Christians as this kind of neo-Marxist construct in Christian clothing. And I imagine all religions at various times have had elements of that,
Yeah.
pushing forward, trying
Yeah.
to.
No, yeah, absolutely. Politics mixes in with religion, of course, and then what you also have is just stuff people come up with, right? And then you have like, and then you have on the other side you have an elite that tries to manage and sometimes control and sometimes crack down on all of that, right? So go back to Europe in the 1600s, and the elite tried to crack down hard on the general public, right? This is why we have lost so many traditional festivals. And you see that throughout history. Go back to the 10th century in Spain, and you'll see them, the church elite trying to crack down on these spring celebrations that seem to actually have a lot of carryover um, from pre-Christian Roman traditions around both Priapus and Dionysus and all the fun stuff, right? That's the stuff that got to survive, I guess. Sort of
Yes.
like undercover for a little bit, and then people are like, okay, now we can sort of like relax a little bit, and then you have these celebrations in the streets, and then the church officials begin cracking down on it, and then they disappear again, and then they crop up again, and then disappear again. So this is the sort of the interchange between what the elite that represents a religion is trying to do, and then what all of these practitioners of that religion are trying to do, right?
Mm,
The practitioners out there, they are trying to manage their existence, right? And this is what religion is for. It's to manage our existence,
mm,
and it's to put all of these aspects, and especially biological circumstances in different ways, into an order and manage that. And then, sometimes the elite will be, okay, that's fine, we can deal with that. And at other times they would be like, no, 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 no. That is too far.
So, speaking of the elites, can you tell me about Odin and the relationship between Odin and kings in these old times? Because what I've been told is that once upon a time it was Thor and not Odin who was the chief of the gods. But when you see the Avengers or whatever, you see Odin depicted almost like Zeus as
Mhm.
this kind of this king of the gods, and he indeed seems to have been associated with kings even back at a time when Thor was still the primary god, perhaps the primary god of the people. Is that
Mhm.
more or less your opinion?
So, this is again where we come back to this issue with reconstruction and the source material.
Mm,
What it looks like is that Odin in the medieval period, so after the conversion, has been recast as a sort of a god of kings. And
mm,
we can see this in several sources. For instance, there's the Ynglinga saga, which is the first part of the Norwegian kings sagas. And there we have sort of like this weird roundabout explanation for how Odin ended up becoming sort of a god of kings in the pantheon. And what happens is that in that story, um, the author tries to detach the West Norwegian royal dynasty from Odin and attach him to Freyr instead. And it's a lot of like literary sort of playing around and a bunch of tricks, honestly, that takes way too long to explain. But the sort of
interesting.
the short version of it is that it seems like we're trying to circumvent a tradition here where we have different dynasties or local rulers who associate with different deities. In some locations is Freyr, in some locations is Njörður, in some locations is Odin, and possibly also Thor. And the author is sort of like trying to synthesize it and then sort of push Odin to the side so that
Huh.
Freyr becomes the good guy here. And this probably has something to do with some older associations of Odin. Um, we can see that sort of in deep history, in deep time, he's a deity that is definitely connected with runes and priesthood, I would call it, for lack of a better term. Um, so he is a god of people who are cult authorities or religious authorities,
Hmm.
at least from the 500s. And with that comes the drinking rituals that seem to have been, in a historical context, influenced from Bacchanalia to some degree. And and this all sort of converges in these locations that are referred to as temples before. We call them magnate farms. What we have is a longhouse, sometimes an auxiliary building where we can see that there's been a lot of sacrifices going on. We can see in the longhouse that there's been a lot of drinking activity. And then we can also see in the general space around that there's been seasonal markets where people have come together, traded, and all of these things. And there's also usually a smithy. In some cases, you have barracks looking structures where it indicates military presence, and this is all in a enclosure. Usually it's also next to some kind of a natural site that seems to have been important. So there's a location in Denmark called Tisø, where that means Tyr's lake. And so
Hmm.
this is a lake that probably was dedicated to the god Tyr. And we have found a lot of sacrifices, offerings of all kinds in the lake. The largest gold ring that has ever been found in Scandinavia comes from that lake. So, yeah, that must have been a really, really important location. And so you have these multifunctional sites, and that's why the archaeologists don't like calling them temples, and also a bit because they don't want to play into exactly what you were speaking about before, giving people these ideas about what a temple is in that sense. And and we assume that these locations, they were sort of ruled by a magnate of some kind. We don't really want to call them kings because we can't really see that there is the social structure that would support what we identify as kings today at the time.
Could we call them a giver of rings?
A giver of rings would probably be appropriate, right? That's what they do. They hand out gold rings to their following of various kinds,
kind
the
of
warriors.
Sauron, but less evil.
Yes, and so they would rule this from this little location. Probably they would probably also travel around to other locations. Most Scandinavian monarchies were traveling monarchies far into the medieval period where they would live at different castles. So there wasn't really a capital until like the 1400s. And it was the same with hereditary rule. Hereditary rule is a relatively late phenomenon in Scandinavia too. So you do have some ideas already in the 11th and 12th and 13th century about hereditary rule, but you also have the kings still have to negotiate with at least the powerful families, the aristocracy around, go to the general assemblies in the different parts of their country, and then actually be ratified as king. Otherwise, they're not king. So those structures they come relatively late, and so back in the 500s, it looks like we have these magnates who associate themselves with Odin. They throw relatively lavish parties. They sacrifice a lot of animals, and Odin plays an important role because when you read, again, going back to Snorri Sturluson's Edda, when you read what he writes about Odin there, it very much looks like the same setup, like this magnate king who has a retinue of warriors that, you know, in Valhalla, they're of course the Einherja, they're the dead warriors that go to Odin.
It reminds me of a book by Chris Kershaw that posits that Odin is the very, very ancient leader of the sort of like Eurasian steppe wolf cult warrior band. And so it would seem then that a kingly association with Odin would imply some association with the greatest of the warriors, which would be a legitimizing and probably a very positive thing for a king to derive from. But that doesn't seem like it would lend itself naturally to hereditary rule.
Exactly. This would be in this period that I'm talking about, the 500s up through the Viking Age. It would be a warrior king who had to some degree demonstrated their ability. So there's a level of an aspect of meritocracy in this structure as well. Now, the question is, how old is it? We can't really tell how far back it goes in time, but I would say, you know, in the 300s, we probably have a different situation. We probably have because what we can see in the place name material in southern Scandinavia is that it looks like, for instance, you know, a sort of the patriarchal inheritance of land seems to be introduced in the period between 400 and 600. We can see that in place names where we have very distinct male names, and then a suffix that means that this is their inherited land. So they're from that period, and they're actually their precursor is from Thuringia in what is now central Germany. So there is a cultural link between southern Scandinavia and Thuringia in this period. And there we have sort of like the establishment of what we could call a patriarch who rules their land in that sense, and they have that nice little space where all of these rituals take place. What happened before that seems a little more nebulous. It was probably more a sort of um, a maybe a tribal assemblies governing the situation.
I mean that patriarchal land ownership sounds very pastoral,
Mm-hmm.
um, anthropologically. So would that tell us anything at all about what might have come before, or is it sort of, do we have archaeological evidence of what it might have looked like, or is it mostly guesswork?
It's mostly guesswork. It's mostly based on few Roman sources reporting a little here and there. Again, also keep in mind most of the the Roman reports are based in military culture, which could be very different from civilian culture in different ways. The general theory, I think, is that we have a situation where there is, and we have the concept of the thing, which means assembly. And this is a very old concept. And it looks like different geographical locations in Scandinavia had their general assembly where people would come together, and at least the sort of the wealthy families who were the ones who were capable of amassing an army, for instance, were the ones who could vote at that assembly. And this is what the kings have to negotiate later on in the medieval period, right? When they're trying to establish hereditary rule. And so that was probably sort of the original structure. And that would be quote unquote more egalitarian. But I mean, again, let's not go crazy here and assume that there's a democracy, right?
Well, it would fit in. It would fit in with the sort of pastoralist warrior culture that you see in the Iliad, which kind of opens with a meeting of kings who are trying to decide why everyone's dying. And there's a hierarchy, but like people get to speak up as well. So
Yeah,
it's sort of neither democracy nor just straight autocracy, but
yeah.
something kind of negotiated between those two.
Exactly. And all of this always comes down to hands and the number of swords and spears, right?
Right. The
So
final currency.
the final currency. And what it also looks like is that it might have been similar to the Roman situation in the Republic, where this assembly could elect an imperator that could then lead war. And this is probably what we're seeing in the Roman sources when they're talking about the king of the Goths or the king of the Heruli or the king of this and that. That's probably that war leader that is the one who has the mandate to negotiate on behalf of the tribe.
Interesting.
So this is the that person who negotiated on behalf of the tribe was probably in a very close relationship to Odin back then as well. It probably included or required a bunch of initiation rituals and other ritual circumstances before he could even come to that point where he could be elected for that.
Okay. So we might almost be tempted to assume maybe Freyr might be associated with like a peacetime king, and Odin with the wartime king, but in political contexts, war sort of determines other things. So Odin
Yeah,
would be more of the king's king god.
yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And keep in mind, we also have Tyr, who is a very old god as well, and Tiwaz
Right.
in the Proto-Germanic language. We have a couple of inscriptions in mixed Latin and Germanic from the Netherlands and from England. One of them invokes Mars Halamardus, which is Mars, the killer of men. And then another one invokes Mars Thingsko, which means Mars of the assembly. So they have like different, like varying ideas
Like
here where
epithets. Yeah.
yes, Mars who is in charge of this, Mars who's in charge of that, and that's probably Tyr in sort of like a proto form of some kind, or a translated form for that matter,
Mhm.
because we have a lot of cultural mixing in the general Rhineland area and in the area that becomes England after that, between Latin, Greek, and Germanic, and influxes from elsewhere, whatever the Romans are essentially bringing into to northwestern Europe at the time, right? So he could also Tyr could also have been that a peacetime deity, for some peoples. But what I also want to highlight is that if we have that situation of these like local magnates who have sort of created their own little hegemony in a region, then we must also assume that there's probably a lot of variation and a lot of different deities, that take on that role that we later can associate directly with Odin. And keep in mind just how many names Odin has
Oh
in
yeah.
the mythology, right? So it makes sense that what we have left is sort of, first of all, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to like that tradition that existed once. And secondly, um, it's also, as I said before, the product of authors trying to make sense of it all.
Mhm.
And that means on the one hand, they're Christian, so they're trying to make sense of it from a Christian perspective. But on the other hand, they're also academics and scholars. They're people who are genuinely trying. Like Snorri Sturluson was genuinely trying to make sense of the material that he had. And we, of course, don't know what he had exactly. We know that he probably had some texts he was relying on,
He
but
almost comes across as a kind of J.R. Tolkien of his time, a sort of
he is,
Christian advancing
yeah,
pagan ideas.
yeah,
But
he is in many ways. And he has also had the same type of contact actually as Tolkien did with this material. He has stories that he's been told as a child. He has stories that he hears from other people as an adult. He knows poetry by heart. He has some written literature, and then he has a bunch of stories that he also knows are attached to different places around in Iceland and perhaps elsewhere in Scandinavia. And he's possibly also had visual material of various kinds, tapestries that have survived from the Viking Age and were still hanging in buildings where he existed, where he lived or visited. It's even possible that some of these Undvigisúlur, or high seat pillars that the settlers brought over, that they would cast overboard and then watch them float ashore and then take land where they landed. It's possible some of those had survived, and other artifacts like that. So there's even the possibility that when he went to Norway, in 1218, he probably also saw some rune stones and other runic inscriptions, possibly in churches as well. And all of this that comes together as his presentation.
hmm,
And so in that sense, I mean, uh, we shouldn't throw too much shade on him for trying to put it all into a Christian framework, because
right,
he's also genuinely trying, I would say,
and he's
and has,
preserving it too.
yes, yeah. So yeah, that's sort of like the background. And again, so if you come back to the subject of like reconstructing,
Hmm.
I think it's important to look at um general values. So, for instance, a general value that you can extract from the Icelandic saga material is family matters. That's a core value that's constantly present, and family sovereignty, even. Right? So,
Yes.
what you typically see, right, is discord between different families, and that, like, if a person from one family has a problem with a person from another family, that spills into the entire family networks, right? And so I would say that would be a core value if you are a person who want to reconstruct in that sense, try to figure out what is this pre-Christian religion and how can I apply it to my world today.
So you're not
And
just imitating the appearances, but trying to see past the appearances and what the subject being conveyed is. It brings to
exactly.
mind that line from Valuspa where they talk about brother killing brother as a kind of component of a hellish end of the world, even.
Right? I think that is a very potent line. Right? When family turns on family, then we have a serious problem
Yeah,
in society. And so and that's why I would say, I would go beyond saying family matters to saying family sovereignty, right? So the whole purpose, it looks like from the saga material, is to ensure the existence and preservation of your family. And you as an individual actually don't matter that much um, if the family preserves. That's
right.
something that we also see a lot. Um, but then what we should keep in mind here is that the sort of like the immediately available values of all of that um, that are expressed in this literature, they're perhaps not always as applicable. For instance, it's a very bad idea to base a society on blood feuds. Like the
Yes, I mean blood feuds are, according to our one of the more famous American Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes, that the problem of the blood feud is supposedly the origin of all of law. Is
exactly
how
right.
can we solve this problem?
Exactly. And that's exactly when you go back to the 13th and 14th century, all over Scandinavia, we can see from folk tales, from folk songs, and law material for that matter, they're trying to get rid of the blood feud because that was the primary way to ensure your safety in the earliest systems, in the pre-Christian system. And it is basically what brings Iceland under Norwegian rule in the end in 1262.
Interesting.
The what you have in when Iceland is established, you have 415 different like settlers and their families, right? And so that is like a very pluralistic type of situation where they then decide we will create a general assembly where those who are considered Gordar, so that translates loosely to chieftains, they're the ones who meet and get to vote on things. So when that happens, roughly a century, maybe even like a century and a half after the first people have started settling in Iceland, is that we're down to what is it, 38 families. So from 415 to 38. And then by the time of Snorri Sturluson, when he's alive in the beginning of the 1200s, we're down to 7 families. So over time, they weed out competition, right?
Jeez.
And then we end with one Norwegian king. So what essentially what that tells us is that the blood feud and that way of managing a society, that will eventually lead to a hostile takeover, a breakdown
Yeah.
of that old structure. So conclusion is family sovereignty, but without such things as blood feud. That's it. That's a value from that period that we can take out and say we have now progressed to a modern situation, and we will find a better
Yes.
solution for it.
Yes, it's fascinating to hear that from the Nordic perspective because I've been exploring this. There's a play by or a sequence of plays rather by Aeschylus called the Oresteia about
Mm-hmm.
the the Atreides family blood feud where the whole family is just killing each other, and it finally concludes with the first trial by jury and telling the Furies, the spirit of vengeance, you will be honored, but you will not be able to continue to you spread vengeance. You will be those of good intentions, um, Eumenides,
I like
instead of
that.
yeah.
That's a good way to solve your problems.
Yeah, it's I love seeing those. those crossovers. And I like to imagine, I hope it's true that these are convergent evolution, sort of independent discoveries rather than just one common source, because the solutions seem to all come after the points of geographic divergence anyways.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I definitely think you're right about that. It's definitely um yeah, they happen independently of each other, even though, there's a lot of precipitation of Greek and Roman philosophy into the North in different ways. People actually underestimate the level to which the northern part of Europe has been influenced in different ways.
well, especially if
Uh,
they're saying Odin is from Troy.
yeah, right. And so what happens in the medieval period is, of course, that Scandinavians gain access to a lot of classical literature in different ways. Um, but even before that, there's as I mentioned before, it very much looks like some of the ritual situations that happen in the 500s. They're inspired by the Bacchanalia. Um, and this we can sort of trace a faint trail all the way back to the 200s of sort of like those kinds of inspirations. And so so this is what we should keep in mind. There's a lot of going back and forth between the northern parts of Europe and the southern parts of Europe. What happens mostly, though, is at least based off of what we know genetically about Scandinavians, is that those people who leave Scandinavia, they don't tend to come back until we're dealing with the Viking Age. In the Viking Age, we see a lot of people coming back again.
Hmm.
Um, but in the 4, 5, 600s, it's more a situation of Scandinavians leaving and then very few coming back. We have one historical instance of that. It's the tribe called the Heruli, who had a kingdom in sort of the intersection between Slovakia and Austria and Hungary in the late 400s, beginning of the 500s. Then it was destroyed by the Langobards. And then we're told that the Heruli returned to the north where they came from. And around the same time, we do see some rune stones that seem to mention the name Heruli in its Germanic form, Erilas.
Hmm.
And there's something happening there. There's like some social dynamics that change in southern Scandinavia with that as well. That might
Huh.
go back to the whole establishment of the magnate farms and all that too. So that would be an example, I would say, of a major reconfiguration of society, and therefore also, I would assume, a considerable reconfiguration of the religion that exists in that society.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, Matthias, we've been talking for about an hour, covering a tremendous amount of historical information and theory and stuff. I wanted to ask where people can find your books and your works, and I think you have a podcast of your own out. But one final question, if I could take a few more minutes, if from all of this archaeological information from these sagas and these other literature, for someone who's maybe looking to explore paganism and wondering, well, if I can't really trust these stories directly, anyways, and if I'm not sure what I can take from the archaeology other than here are some interesting facts, how would I take this information and apply it to? I love your definition of organizing my life in a more consciously religious fashion. How would I go about doing that?
Yes. So this is where that is a difficult question to answer, because I do this based on having read so much, and I do not expect anybody to go out and do the same. Um, I I would say start with intuition. Start with, well, what is it that matters to me as a person in my life? And personally, I hope that immediately thereafter you would say, well, the things that matter to me in my life are like my family, these close, dependable relations, my friendships, um, living a good, happy, healthy life, being in surroundings that support me, and such things. Like I hope that's what people conclude when they ask themselves that question. And and then I would also say, read Marcus Aurelius. like like if there's a philosopher who like really excels in sort of like helping you answer those questions for yourself, I would say that it is him in his meditations.
Just like cognitive behavioral therapy before there was cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right. Like it's actually it's I yeah, it's I always go back to do his meditations. I have done that for like 20 something years at this point.
Mhm.
And I would say that if you as an individual and you're asking yourself those questions and you don't feel that you're coming up with good solutions, then read him, because he is definitely a good help for that. And then I would say go through the saga literature, go through all the source material that you want to read on all of this stuff, and navigate it with that in the back of your mind. I think that's a really good approach. And also go on a hike. Go out and get some fresh air and and experience some trees and some nature.
Excellent, wonderful. And we can maybe you can't say this, but I can say this. Also, maybe a book to read might be Asatru for Beginners: A Modern Heathen's Guide to the Ancient Northern Way by oh, this name looks familiar. Mathias Nordvig.
Thank you. Yeah,
Uh,
no, I was trying to not be too self-promoting there.
oh, that's the whole reason to come on to podcasts like this, because people I think like learning about this, and some people just want the brief cliff notes top view, and podcasts are great for that, but a lot of people want to go deeper, and we have these books by incredible people who spend their whole lives researching these things to share information with people who absolutely want to learn it. And I love being that intermediary that brings people who want to know to people like you or Dr. Naj or Jack Donovan or whoever else they might be looking to learn from. And
It's
it's an absolute honor to be able to do that.
Yeah, and it's a very important function as well. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, if people want to know where they can find me, you can find me on Instagram if you just put in my name, Mathias Nordvig. That's spelled Mathiasnordvig. Just so there are no confusions. I've seen my especially my first name spelled in a lot of different ways in this country.
Too many T's, I would imagine.
Too many T's sometimes, and E that just came out of nowhere, that kind of stuff. You can also check out my website. That's again my name, MathiasNordvig.com. And my podcast is the Sacred Flame. That you can find that on any kind of platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all of those places. You can also find it on my website if you like to use a browser, and yeah, go from there.
Cool. I'll put links to all those in the description here. I need to upload all these to YouTube at some point. I'm like 8 weeks behind on that. It's all on Spotify at the moment, but it'll get there.
I
It'll
hope my background with a bunch of boxes and all that kind of stuff isn't going to be too annoying on YouTube. I'm in the middle of a
Oh
remodel, so
no, you're fine. Most of it is only audio, anyways. I could put video, but yeah, it's always a pleasure. Again, thanks so much for coming on and chatting. It's been an absolute pleasure. I actually would like to read some of your stuff myself.
well,
But anyways, thanks so much for coming on.
yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been quite a pleasure and an honor.